Let's talk about something that might surprise you. When we discuss global superpowers, China always seems to dominate the conversation. The narrative is everywhere. China is rising, China's the future, China will overtake America. But here's what nobody wants to say out loud: Europe is actually more of a superpower than China, and I'm going to show you exactly why that's true. First, let's get the numbers straight, because this is where the entire China as a superpower myth starts to crumble. The European Union just recently surpassed China in GDP measured in real terms. Let that sink in for a moment. After decades of breathless coverage about China's unstoppable economic rise, Europe has pulled ahead. The EU's combined economy now stands larger than China's when you measure for actual purchasing power and real economic output. We're looking at roughly 18 to 19 trillion for the EU compared to China's 17 trillion economy, which has been struggling with the real estate collapse, demographic decline, and slowing growth. But here's the critical difference that China bulls conveniently ignore: GDP per capita. The average European enjoys a standard of living that's roughly 5 times higher than the average Chinese citizen. We're talking about 45,000 to 50,000 per capita in the EU versus around 10,000 in China. This isn't just statistical curiosity, it fundamentally matters for what constitutes real economic power. A superpower isn't just about having a lot of people producing a lot of stuff. It's about having sophisticated, high value economies that generate innovation, wealth, and influence. Europe has that. China, for all its factories, is still predominantly a middle income country with hundreds of millions of people living in conditions that would be unthinkable in Europe. And here's what really matters: China's growth story is over. The easy gains from urbanization and cheap labor are gone. Meanwhile, Europe's economy is built on sustainable foundations: innovation, services, high value manufacturing. China's economy is built on debt, real estate bubbles, and infrastructure spending that's hitting diminishing returns. Let's talk about technology, because this is where China's superpower credentials really fall apart. Sure, China has Huawei and TikTok, but let's look at the bigger picture. Europe is home to SAP, ASML, Siemens, Airbus, Spotify, LVMH, and countless other global leaders in their respective fields. The EU leads the world in pharmaceutical production, luxury goods, advanced manufacturing, and green technology. But here's what really matters: Europe doesn't need to steal to innovate. The EU produces more scientific research papers per capita than China. European universities consistently rank among the world's best. When European companies develop technology, the world trusts it because it wasn't built on intellectual property theft and forced technology transfers. ASML, the Dutch company, makes the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines that are absolutely essential for advanced semiconductor production. China literally cannot make advanced chips without European technology. Think about that for a second. The country that's supposed to be this rising tech superpower is utterly dependent on a single European company for its most critical technology. That's not what superpower status looks like. China's tech sector is built on a foundation of borrowed, stolen, and reverse engineered technology. When you look at Chinese innovation, you're often looking at iterative improvements on Western inventions, not fundamental breakthroughs. Europe, meanwhile, gave the world the jet engine, discovered penicillin, invented the World Wide Web, and continues to lead in everything from renewable energy to particle physics at CERN. The semiconductor restrictions have exposed just how vulnerable China is. Without access to European and American technology, China's AI ambitions, its advanced manufacturing, its entire technological future is at risk. Europe holds the keys, and Beijing knows it. Now, I see what you're thinking. China has a massive military, and yes, they do, but size isn't everything, and this is where Europe's advantages become really clear. European nations collectively spend over 300 billion on defense annually, and that number is rising fast as Europe wakes up to global threats. France and the UK are nuclear powers with power projection capabilities that China can only dream of. France maintains military bases across Africa and the Pacific. The UK has a global military footprint. European nations are integrated into NATO, the most powerful military alliance in human history. China has a large army, sure, but it's largely untested and designed for regional conflicts. China has exactly one overseas military base, in Djibouti. Europe has military presence on every continent. When there's a crisis anywhere in the world, European forces can and do respond. China can barely project power beyond its immediate neighborhood. And let's be brutally honest about what China's military buildup actually represents. It's a regional power trying to desperately control its own backyard. China can't even confidently take Taiwan, an island 100 miles from its coast, without risking catastrophic losses. Meanwhile, European forces have global reach and have proven their capability in conflicts from the Balkans to Mali to Afghanistan. The quality gap is enormous. European militaries train with the best, use the most advanced equipment, and have actual combat experience. China's military is bloated, corrupt, and built more for internal control and regional intimidation than actual power projection. Here's something that really separates pretenders from true superpowers: reserve currency status. The euro is the world's second reserve currency, held by central banks globally and used in international transactions everywhere. It represents about 20% of global reserves. The Chinese renminbi, about 2 to 3%. That's it. After decades of China trying to internationalize its currency, after all the Belt and Road initiatives and all the talk about challenging the dollar, the RMB is barely used outside of China. Why? Because nobody trusts it. The currency isn't freely convertible. China manipulates its value. The Chinese financial system is opaque and controlled by the Communist Party. The euro, meanwhile, is trusted globally because it's backed by independent central banks, rule of law, and transparent institutions. When international businesses do deals, they do them in dollars or euros, not yuan. That's real economic power. And as China's economy slows and its debt problems mount, confidence in the renminbi is falling, not rising. The capital flight from China tells you everything you need to know. Chinese citizens themselves don't trust their own system enough to keep their money there. Let's talk about something that's harder to quantify but absolutely essential to superpower status: soft power. Europe is a cultural superpower in ways that China simply isn't and may never be. People around the world want to visit Paris, Barcelona, Rome, and Berlin. They want to study at Oxford, Cambridge, or the Sorbonne. They consume European fashion, film, music, and literature. European values, democracy, human rights, environmental protection shape global discourse even when they're not perfectly practiced at home. What does China export culturally? Authoritarian governance, censorship. The world isn't clamoring to adopt the Chinese model. When developing nations choose their systems, they look to Europe's social democracies, not Beijing's surveillance state. The EU sets global standards that companies worldwide must follow. GDPR privacy regulations, European. Environmental standards, Europe leads. Product safety requirements, Europe sets the bar. China tries to buy its influence through the Belt and Road Initiative, but it's increasingly seen as debt trap diplomacy. Countries are waking up to what Chinese investment really means: loss of sovereignty, poor quality infrastructure, and debt they can't repay. Europe offers genuine partnerships based on shared values and mutual benefit. Here's something that separates real superpowers from large countries: institutions. Europe built the modern international order. The EU itself is the most sophisticated supranational governance structure in human history. It's an unprecedented pooling of sovereignty that has created peace and prosperity across a continent that spent centuries at war. China, meanwhile, tries to undermine international institutions when they don't serve Beijing's interests. The EU works within the WTO, the UN, the International Criminal Court. China ignores international court rulings it doesn't like. Remember when they simply dismissed the tribunal ruling on the South China Sea? The EU has negotiated trade agreements with countries on every continent. It speaks with one voice, representing 450 million people and the world's largest single market in international forums. When Europe negotiates, countries listen because the access to the European market is essential. China's institutions are brittle and authoritarian. There's no rule of law, just rule by the party. Contracts aren't sacred. Property rights are conditional. The entire system depends on the whims of Xi Jinping and the CCP. That's not a foundation for sustainable superpower status. Let's address the elephant in the room: China's demographic crisis. The country is aging faster than any society in human history. The working age population is shrinking. The one child policy created a demographic time bomb that's now exploding. By 2050, China will have more retirees than workers in some scenarios. Recent data shows China's population is already declining. They're facing a demographic collapse that will gut their economy for decades. Who's going to support all those retirees? Who's going to man the factories? Who's going to keep the economy going? Europe has demographic challenges too, but it has something China doesn't: immigration. Europe can and does attract talent from around the globe. People want to move to Europe. They want European passports, European social systems, European opportunities. Who's trying to emigrate to China? Almost nobody. The migration flow is still outward from China, not inward. Chinese citizens themselves send their money and their children abroad, often to Europe when they have the chance. That tells you everything you need to know about where people see opportunity and freedom. China is growing old before it grows rich. Europe is already rich and has the mechanisms to manage its demographic transition. That's the difference between a real superpower and a pretender. Now that the EU has surpassed China in real GDP, we need to talk about what that actually means. China's economy is riddled with problems. The real estate sector, which accounted for roughly 30% of GDP, has collapsed. Evergrande, Country Garden, and dozens of other developers have defaulted. Ghost cities sit empty. Local governments are drowning in debts. China's growth model is broken. They can't rely on exports anymore because the world is diversifying away from Chinese manufacturing. They can't rely on infrastructure spending because they've already built everything. They can't rely on real estate because that bubble has burst. They can't rely on consumption because Chinese households are too indebted and too worried about the future to spend. Europe's economy, meanwhile, is based on sustainable fundamentals: high value services, advanced manufacturing, innovation driven growth. Yes, Europe has challenges, but it's not facing the kind of systemic crisis that China is staring down. So, why does any of this matter? Because we need to stop treating China as an inevitable superpower and recognize Europe for what it actually is: a proven, established power with real economic weight, technological leadership, military capability, and global influence. The fact that the EU has now surpassed China in GDP is just the latest proof that the China miracle was oversold. China is a large, middle income country with serious structural problems and an aging population, a brittle political system, and an economy that's run out of steam. It's a regional power with regional ambitions that's been masterful at propaganda but hasn't actually achieved superpower status. Europe, meanwhile, is the world's largest economy in real terms, a technological leader, a military power with real global reach, a cultural superpower, and the closest thing that we have to a model for prosperous, sustainable development. The EU's GDP per capita is higher, its technology is more advanced, its institutions are more trusted. The China as a superpower narrative serves Beijing's interests by making its rise seem inevitable, but inevitability is a myth. China faces massive challenges that may prove insurmountable. Europe, for all its problems and internal disagreements, remains a genuine superpower economically, technologically, militarily, and culturally. It's time we stopped underestimating Europe and overestimating China. The numbers don't lie, and the reality is clear. Europe has overtaken China economically and leads in virtually every other measure that matters for superpower status. Not because Europe is perfect, it isn't, but because real power is about more than just size and noise. It's about innovation, institutions, influence, and the ability to project values and capabilities globally. And on those measures, Europe is the superpower that China still aspires to become, but likely never will. The Chinese economic miracle is over. The European superpower is here to stay.